Continuing now, an interview I recorded earlier today with Congressman Steve King of Iowa. He reflected on many subjects, including the talk that President Obama will cut short his vacation, returning to Washington this weekend. What might the president have in store? The congressman speculated about that and offered his thoughts on a few other subjects.
So we watched and listened to the process, and they're simply processing people through. I watched as a pregnant woman was boarded onto an inflated raft with two coyotes that ran her across the river at Roma, Texas. Border Patrol stood there up on the bank with me and two local city police. They dropped this pregnant woman off on the shore. The coyote got out, helped her out of the raft, handed her 2 bags of her things. They got back in and went across the river, deflated their raft, folded it in their trunk, and left. She stood there and waited for the Border Patrol. She gets processed. She gets a transit slip or a document that allows her to travel in the United States. And on the promise of a hearing, the baby will be born in America and become an American citizen before she gets a hearing. That's the process. We're escorting people, and baby or not, then we're escorting them up into the United States. It's by plane and by bus. I don't know if it's by train. Unlikely in this country these days, unless it's Amtrak, we know.
Well, a couple of minutes remain, Steve, and you mentioned the word amnesty. Now, we understand the president is going to interrupt his vacation at Martha's Vineyard, come back to Washington this weekend. There is speculation that he is going to try and grant amnesty through executive order. Do you believe he will do that? And if so, what will happen?
Well, I'm very concerned that he might do that. The information that I'm getting is that he was likely to, but now there's a sense that the timing of it might mean that he may be a little less than even unlikely, and whether he does a stroke of his pen. If he does that, if he uses this, as he said, his cell phone and his pen to conduct the business of the United States Congress while we are out of session, and the president doesn't command the Congress to pass a law. He needs to come on bended knee and say, I'd like to have you pass this because I think it's good for the country. Use his persuasive powers, not the intimidation powers. But if he does, JD, I will say that it will bring about a constitutional crisis. And the United States Congress should go back into immediate special session to take this up.
We got that from you. Constitutional crisis, immediate session. Before you go, mentioning the presidency and one who hopes to occupy that position, we've got video a couple of weeks ago in Iowa. There you were with Rand Paul. A couple of so-called dreamers come up to accost you, basically. Rand Paul takes a bite of his sandwich, gets up, and moves away eventually. Not so much to what you had to say to the dreamers, but what about Senator Paul's action?
Well, he made a decision that being in a video that was a setup from the beginning wasn't going to be a constructive place for him to be if he wants to be the next president of the United States. And that was his call. Mine was to stand in there and defend the rule of law.
And we understand that you did, and that'll have to do it, Steve. Under the edicts of the 4-letter word time, we had to cut that interview with Steve King. Thank him for his time. But the question we're asking you today, in terms of the fact that so many school districts across the country are going to have to welcome in hundreds, if not thousands, of illegal alien students, despite the ruling of the Supreme Court back in the 80s, should illegal kids be deported or should they be schooled? Courtesy of your tax dollars. You see where to go to answer that poll, newsmax.com/poll.
Interesting question there. We'll look forward to those responses. And this issue, a lot of folks will see this next week when there are many school districts in Florida going back to school. Florida, one of those states where they're having the highest number of these kids who have been released to a family member or some sort of other relative.
Absolutely. We're going to have to see how we deal with this without having all the numbers there yet.
Yeah. All right. We got some other stories to talk about as well. Let's get to a quick Newsmax Now update. Right now, the fighting between Israel and Hamas seems to be on hold and staying that way. Both sides have agreed to a 5-day ceasefire after failing to reach a long-term peace agreement after that 72-hour ceasefire that expired at midnight. So far, this is the longest ceasefire since the fighting started last month in Gaza. There were still a few attacks, though. The Israeli military said Hamas launched 8 rockets overnight, but stopped firing earlier today. Israel retaliated with airstrikes on Gaza. Both sides will continue to negotiate, along with Egypt, for a longer-term truce. And today, Pope Francis is visiting South Korea. The president of South Korea hosted an official welcoming ceremony for the pontiff. After the ceremony, Pope Francis signed a guest book inside the home of the South Korean head of state during his 5-day visit. Francis is looking to encourage a vibrant and growing local church seen as a model for the future of Catholicism. It's the first papal visit since Pope John Paul II traveled to South Korea back in 1989.
But North Korea is not happy with the Pope's visit. They fired 3 short-range projectiles less than an hour before he arrived. North Korea declined an invitation to meet Francis, but that's not going to stop the Pope. He plans to reach out to North Korea in a mass for peace and reconciliation on the war-divided Korean peninsula.
Well, when missionaries David and Nancy Ripoll went to Liberia, they knew they would see poverty and suffering, but the last thing they expected was working with people infected with Ebola.
Though Nancy contracted the Ebola virus disease, we do not see that as a failure on God's part.
Well, David Ripoll there speaking to reporters via Skype yesterday. He also said that Nancy and he have both turned to their faith to help during the outbreak. And as Nancy Ripoll continues to recover, she's currently in quarantine in Atlanta. David Ripoll in quarantine as well up in North Carolina. He says his wife is improving. She's received that experimental treatment and is getting some of the best care she can possibly get there at Emory Hospital. But our thoughts and prayers are with them. Amen.
And when you think about the missionaries in the field, so many people there trying to help the people in Africa afflicted with Ebola. It's a tough thing, and in one sense an inspiring thing to see them hard at work. There's more to come on America's Forum.